everybody. First, let me apologize in advance. I have a bit of a chest cold. I've had one for a week, and it's taken a bit of energy out of me, but I hope everyone can understand me and everybody has a good time. So, we're in crypto winter. It's getting pretty cold outside. It's been a fun year last year. I went to 30 countries, and I had a chance to meet really some amazing people. And to me, it doesn't feel like winter at all. It feels like we're just getting started. How about for you? All right. Well, anyway, I like giving historical presentations. The why are we here and what is this all about? And why should we care type stuff. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of products and there's a lot of technology, and you get easily lost in all the details. You know, everybody has some wonderful scaling solution. Everybody has a new smart contract system. Everybody has a new vision of how they're going to go ahead and achieve some new feature capability. But at the end of the day, these are just means to ends. And I think it's very important for us as a movement to understand why do we want to go in a particular direction versus another. So the story of our space begins a long, long time ago. It doesn't begin in 2009 with the invention of Bitcoin, but rather it starts with the invention of the internet, and it starts with the cypherpunk movement. The internet was an invitation for society to dream about the consequences of information moving at the speed of light. Throughout all of human history, there were hierarchical classes of people, and we would segregate them by who gets to be in the know and who gets to act on that information. So if you were a king or a priest, or if you were a lord, or if you were a president or a governor, you would have access to knowledge, information, and flows of information that everybody else just simply didn't have. Then suddenly this technology comes out and it changes the entire world, where people, no matter where they live, they can be in Zimbabwe, they can be out in the middle of Alaska, doesn't really matter, suddenly will have access to the same information flows as the most elite. In fact, today, every one of you has access to more information than Bill Clinton did when he was president of the United States. It's a pretty profound thought. He was president from 1992 to 2000, so not very long ago. Most of you were alive in those time period. Yet you have more information than he did, despite the fact that he was head of the largest economy in the world and the most powerful country in the world for its time. So the cypherpunk movement predicted this. They said, well, we're all going to live in a society where everybody knows each other's business. We're all going to live in a society where everybody at any moment can know anything. And they started asking questions like, what will this do to our education system? What will this do to our voting systems? What will this do to our marketplaces? All of marketing is constructed at creating a fiction about a product, a vision of it. This is our product. This is what our product is all about. And those narratives rely very heavily on mediums and environments and information flows. Suddenly we can go to Amazon and we can just take a look at the customer reviews. Suddenly I can just go and Google anything I want, any product I want, and instantly I get hundreds of different opinions from experts all around the world. And if you look at the consequences of that, there are now malls all around the United States which are ghost towns. Tons of big box stores keep going out of business or going bankrupt, like Sears. Once a great giant, a huge innovator, now it's on its death throes. Others like JCPenney's are soon on their way out as well. So the cypherpunk movement said, let's start having a discussion about this. And the core of society has always been your money. Because in a way, it is your personal power. How much money you have really determines the things that you can do in life. The places you can go, whether you can take a vacation or not, whether you can take a break or not, whether retirement is going to be a joyous affair or one where you have to live with constant scarcity, whether your children can go to college or not, the type of health care you receive. So it is pretty worthwhile to have a discussion of, well, where is the money of the world going to go? And there was all these ideas saying, well, now money can move instantaneously, anywhere, anytime. In fact, we no longer need central banks. A lot of theory from the 19th century and the early 20th century from the Austrian economics side was dredged up, and people started inventing concepts of private monies again. Monies backed by gold, monies backed by real estate or other resources, and we don't need banks and we don't need governments. We can just do it ourselves. It was a great fertile time. The problem was that neither society nor technology was quite ready for it. So while these conversations started in the 1980s, they never actually went anywhere. We saw some great ventures started like DigiCash, and a lot of the early pioneers in our space like Hal Finney and others were doing interesting work, but it didn't become big. Then suddenly, the internet revolution happened, and actually all of a sudden everybody had a web browser and everybody could get online, and high-speed internet started rolling its way out, and suddenly computers got thousands of times faster, and suddenly a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto came up with a way to make most of this stuff decentralized as a proof of concept. And then we saw some things changing. It was really an invitation for us to begin a grand monetary experiment. So 7 years ago, I joined this space. And when I started, it was very small. There's not many people in it. My very first Bitcoin meetup group I signed up for, there was 2 people who registered, myself and one other person. The other person didn't show up. So I had a nice conversation with myself about my love of Bitcoin. And it was a good conversation, actually. Anyway, since that time, I've watched the movement grow. In fact, I was recently in Mongolia, and I talked to a camel herder. In Mongolia, they have the 2-hump camels, not the one. And they're coming running by, and I found out the camel herder actually has Bitcoin. Think about that. A country of 900,000 nomads, 3 million people. When they get tired of living somewhere, they just follow their animals wherever they happen to go. They don't really have electric bills or taxes or things like that. They are pretty independent people. Yet somehow still, they're buying Bitcoin. And somehow still, they're starting to get involved. So it's a natural question to ask, why, in just such a short period of time, 7 years, has it become so infectious that people, even in countries you'd never think would want to participate or do something, do so? Well, that's the crux. It's going back down to that very personal thing. What makes good money? We all know the economic definition. We have these concepts like store of value and unit of exchange, and unit of account and means of exchange, these types of things. So, can it hold its value, and can you get products and services for it, and so forth. But at its core, money is social. It's also belief-based. You have this thing in your pocket, and you think it's going to be worth something. That's why you keep it there. And other people think it's going to be worth something. That's why they're willing to accept it for products and services. And the reason we put governments in charge is because they're middlemen of necessity. They need to be there to protect the supply and make sure we don't print lots of extra units, right? And when private interests have historically done it, there's been failures and bad things. The United States was a great example of that. During the 19th century, hundreds of banks issued their own money. Almost all of them failed within the first 10 to 20 years, resulting in everybody losing all their money. So we're going through this all over again. We're also going through the need for regulation all over again. We're learning why financial laws exist. We're learning why things were classified securities to begin with. We're learning what happens when people have inside information. And great fortunes are being made, just like the baronial age, and great fortunes are being lost, and it's a difficult, stressful time. But the difference is that this is a very democratic time. What's really amazing to me is I've been talking to now people all over the world, and everyone seems to have not only an opinion, but the capacity to do something with that opinion. It doesn't stop with a philosophy. It continues on with, well, I'm building something. And it continues on with, well, I have a partnership. And it continues on with, I've been talking to my government. We're in Uganda. We're in Ethiopia. We're in Angola. We're in South Africa. And every place we go, John O'Connor goes, my director of African operations, or I go, it's the same narrative of, well, we have this problem. In the case of Angola, they have all this gold, and they can't sell it. It's really tragic to think about that. You have one of the most valuable substances in the world, and you're rich with it, tons of it. And because of bad marketplaces, and because you can't interface with the global markets properly, the only way to sell it is to sell it for 2 to 3 cents on the dollar. So if it's worth 100, you're selling it for $2 to $3. Think about that. That's the situation they live in. Similar situation in Mongolia, similar situation for agricultural goods in Uganda and Rwanda and other places. And usually the conversation would stop, or they would lament that the United States is not helping them, or the European Union is not helping them. But now, they don't really care to ask for help. They're actually saying, let's build something. Let's issue a cryptocurrency. Let's create a new marketplace. So that's a truly amazing thing, and that's what our space as a whole has been enabling. And that's the real value of what we do, not whether the tokens go up or down, not what is the current total size of the coin market cap, and how are we going to make 100x, and how do we do an ICO. It's the fact that people have problems, particular problems, market problems, personal problems. They have inclusion problems. They can't get money to their daughter. They can't get a loan. They can't get an insurance policy. These are very human. And instead of us just lamenting and complaining, the point of our space is to solve these in a way. But the problem is that you can actually solve them in many different ways. You see, right now we're going through a global transition to algorithmic governance. We're going through a global transition that takes advantage of the fact that we have so much raw data being created every single day by all these sensors and all these different people. And some countries, like China, for example, certainly love taking advantage of this and have already dreamed up how their citizens should live in 2050 or 2100. They have this concept of social credit. So basically how it works is every interaction you have, every product you buy, every person you talk to, every medical decision you make, every political preference you make, all of those things get recorded. All your comments on Chinese equivalent of Facebook, all your searches on the Chinese equivalent of Google, they get recorded. And then what they do is they throw algorithms at them, and they give you a number. And if the number is high, you're a good citizen. You get discounts on travel, your taxes can go lower, and maybe you get better hotel rooms. And when your number goes lower instead of higher, all of a sudden your taxes go up. You lose your job. Your freedom of association gets impacted, because guess what? If you have bad social credit, they punish other people for interacting with you. So you become a pariah. And you have a big red letter, a digital red letter on your chest that says, don't talk to. Now, digital money is coming. Cash will one day be phased out. China will put digital money right into this matrix as well. And if your number falls too low, your money gets shut off. This is a reality that over 1 billion people will soon have to live. Pilots are underway in Shanghai and Beijing, and full integration will happen before the end of 2025 to 2030, depending on how quickly they can roll these things out. This is the world that we're marching towards, and it won't just be China. Other regimes will see the value in social stability that such systems can have to gamify being a citizen, to turn everyone into an algorithm. So the point of our space is not just to solve the problems of how do we create marketplaces for billions of people and liquidity for illiquid assets and new definitions of money that are much more efficient and much more egalitarian. It's also about having a conversation of, during the 21st century, how do we want to live? What fundamental freedoms do we want to have? And to whom do we trust to protect those freedoms? We're increasingly living in a global society, and we're increasingly becoming victims of global problems. We no longer live in a world where we have nation states, and those nation states protect us. If you happen to live next door to a larger, meaner nation, if they start polluting your waterways, it doesn't matter if the water gets polluted there, it comes to you. The same for the air. Look at our waste problems we have. They're very pervasive. And so when we think about climate change, we think about resource usage, we think about the treatment of people. These are collective global problems. So there are conversations about, well, how do we have collective global marketplaces and regulation and money? And that's what the cryptocurrency space effectively is all about. It forces us to explicitly talk about concepts like privacy. How private should things be? The transactions you make, they should be recorded. Okay, but what level of privacy should I expect? Should I expect global, absolute privacy where no one can ever know these things? Should I expect that they're private for most people, but if a government wants to know, they get to know? Should they be totally transparent for all people to see? Do I get to make that decision? Is that decision made for me? That's a big foundational question that our space is asking. And my company and other companies, we build this type of technology. Freedom of expression and thought. We have a huge problem in our space of deplatforming. These magical platforms have spun up over the last 10, 15 years. Things like YouTube, things like podcasting. It's really amazing. And you see these incredibly popular stars rise up, and kids who are 20 years old, 25 years old are YouTube stars and are making more money than the celebrities used to make. But along the same token, if they say one thing, the owner of the platform, Google, for example, can just shut them off and demonetize them. They go from making millions to nothing. And there's no appeal process. There's no third party that can come in and say, oh, well, we'll give you your money back. They can sue, I suppose. And then they'll find out that the end user license agreement of that platform gives Google the right to do this. So if millions of people are to make their livelihoods from these new types of platforms, whether they're journalists, whether they're podcasters, whether they have educational videos they sell, and then suddenly the platform operators at any time can shut them out if they politically say the wrong thing. What does that mean? Turns out the very same conversation about privacy and payments and money that our space has brought has also brought potential solutions to those who create content and to those who don't want to be deplatformed. And it's a hard conversation, because some people really do say terrible, deplorable things that are factually inaccurate, mean-spirited, slanderous, incite violence, and in many cases contribute nothing to society. So should they be given a platform? Should they be given a revenue source? We have a big problem. We have a guy named Alex Jones, floats around America, and every single month he tells us how the government's putting poison in the water and turning the frogs gay, and how our toothpaste is going to kill all of us, and how just next month there's going to be a nuclear attack somewhere, and we should hate the government for it. It's all false. None of it's true. In our country, he has a right to say it, and I have a right not to listen. The question is, should he have a right to an income? Should people be able to pay him? And these are some of the challenges of the 21st century when we start talking about the consequences of instantaneous information everywhere, global marketplaces. Certain people can become wildly successful off of thoughts and ideas that aren't right. Should we let them? Moving beyond all of that, we also are moving to a world where you no longer measure your wealth in terms of the nation you come from. You know, we have a guy named Jeff Bezos in America. He's a pretty rich guy, and we say he's worth $150 billion. So does he have $150 billion? No. Jeff has a lot of Amazon stock, and he's got real estate, and he's got gold, and he's got a pretty diversified wealth portfolio. And so what we do is we kind of put a price tag on that. But the reality is, as we move into the 21st century, we're going to stop doing that. We're going to look at wealth more as portfolios, and you're going to be able to get liquidity with those portfolios very quickly. So imagine 10, 20 years into the future, this concept of a universal wallet. Been talking about this for a few years, but it'll come. And basically the idea is take all your stock and your gold and your silver and your land and your T-points and your airline miles and whatever else that you could think of that holds value, you put it all into one digital bucket. And that digital bucket allows you to transfer that at any time to any other instrument of value. So you can go from airline miles to yen, or gold to real estate, or real estate to US dollars. So when you go to Starbucks and you buy that coffee, you tap your phone and they get paid in yen and you paid them in gold. That was your decision. And the allocations of that portfolio are your decision. What does that mean? It means that year by year, you're going to start caring a lot less about the monetary policy of your country, because it doesn't matter anymore. Year by year, you're going to start caring a lot less about how things are around you, because no matter what, you can always just hedge. I have a lot of employees from Ukraine. They refuse to be paid in the local currency. They like being paid in Bitcoin. And similarly, now people under this paradigm can be paid in whatever they want. So it seems to me inevitable that we will start living in an age of competing currencies and an age of wealth represented as a portfolio, as opposed to just whatever currency you happen to live in. And that's going to have some pretty profound consequences. Now, going beyond that, if you look at the breakdown of our space, we started with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, as I mentioned, was a conversation about money. But then with Ethereum, what Vitalik and I were talking about was the problems of the internet itself. We have these big giant data providers like Google and Amazon and massive data centers. And the internet's becoming increasingly centralized, increasingly brittle, and increasingly curated and controlled. And we really wanted to start pushing this idea of decentralized infrastructure. So that was one of the principal reasons why Ethereum was created. Now, over time, Ethereum's evolved, and it will continue to evolve, and I build products to compete, and other people build products to compete. But there's now a whole clique of people in our ecosystem that are talking about how do we decentralize your access to the internet? How do we decentralize data and computation and price these things so that it can compete against Amazon Web Services and Microsoft and these other giant monolithic corporations? Because they understand that if we don't, eventually a small group of companies will have total control over all these resources, and just like with financial regulation, those group of companies will end up being totally controlled themselves by a small group of actors. And as a consequence, all the freedoms we take for granted with the internet will go away, will just evaporate. And finally, there's a group of people in our space who think about how do we apply cryptocurrencies towards these gigantic world-scale problems. Everybody acknowledges that overpopulation and modernization has had dramatic effects on the world environment. We do business in Ethiopia. In the last 100 years, Ethiopia has gone from 10 million people to 100 million people. And in the process of that 10x of population growth, over 90% of the biodiversity of the country has been lost. It's the same in Brazil. It's the same in many other places, like Madagascar. We have become resigned to accepting thousands of species going extinct every single year with no end in sight. Now, why do these problems exist? They exist because of economics. There's incentives to do things in the short term to improve your quality of life that have profound long-term impacts, which are not felt directly by the people who do them. It's your classic externality. So the question is, can you build marketplaces where the incentive to do things like keep animals alive or preserve biodiversity or reduce carbon consumption actually produces more profit than doing these things, doing the harmful things? It's called mechanism design. And it's a pretty cool concept if you think about it. If you create the incentives in just the right way, if you program the game in just the right way, instead of killing the animals, you save the animals. Like, what if a giraffe had a reverse life insurance policy? If you keep it alive, it pays you. If it dies, it stops paying you. Then everybody's going to try to keep it alive, right? Pretty simple concept. And what's really amazing is I've met hundreds of entrepreneurs throughout the years who are not only thinking about these types of things, but have actually started enacting cryptocurrencies and blockchain projects in their local communities, whether it be in Kenya or it be with a sustainable meat farm I saw down in Bolivia, all across the world. So it's pretty cool. So that's the nice part about our industry, is it's an invitation to talk about the problems that humanity is facing and will face. It's an invitation to talk about the future and where we're going. We all acknowledge we live with too much data and information, and algorithms are starting to control us. We all acknowledge that a lot of unelected small factions, big companies, small groups of people, have a huge amount of control over what we think and our day-to-day lives. But for the first time ever as consumers, we have consumer choice, and we have the ability to go and do things our own way, and we have the ability to build things our own way. And there really are no winners or losers yet. The reality is, you guys in the audience can end up in 5 years or 10 years being big players in this industry. It's just like the 1970s with the software industry. Bill Gates was just some nerd who dropped out of Harvard. He had no money. In fact, their first set of office furniture was made out of pizza boxes. That's where they came from. Now he's a big guy, but he wasn't then. And similarly, our industry is much the same way. We haven't picked winners and losers. We haven't picked a dominant philosophy or a dominant technology. Now, I recognized, however, unlike the early days of the software industry, there are certain things that have to be done a bit differently with our industry. In particular, what really bothered me over the last 7 years is the lack of rigor in the science of our space. The reality is that many of the core protocols that we're going to end up using, once we set them, like TCP/IP or others, we're probably going to end up using them for decades. And if we make poor design decisions, we will end up repeating the sins of the internet and the IT revolution, exposing billions of people to security problems, exposing billions of people to substandard performance, or to some degree of centralization or curation. And power brokers will exist to perpetuate that system. So I felt it was extremely important that no matter what direction we go in answering these problems or thinking about protocols that can help solve these types of problems, that we have to involve the university system. So one of the bedrocks of my company has been peer review. Since I started IOHK, we've written more than 40 papers, 40, and more than half of them have gone through successful peer review at major conferences like Eurocrypt, Crypto, and CCS, and so forth. And what's so encouraging to me is that our work, alongside the work of others, has encouraged major academic groups to start actually getting involved. Now we have competitors. Algorithmic out of MIT, Unity out of Cornell, and every single one of them, they're scientists working with engineers and working with some brilliant people, and we're having deep scientific conversations, and most of the science produced is royalty-free, patent-free, open source. So the stuff I do, you can use, and you can use for free, unlike the prior generations work. Second, I firmly believe that whatever we end up building has to work correctly. So my company's invested a great deal of money into engineering called formal methods. Pretty complicated, but the basic idea is write down what you're actually going to do and prove that you did it. Sounds simple enough. It's expensive and time-consuming and hard, but it's necessary, again, because if it doesn't work, who pays the price for that? It's not me. It's you, the consumer. When the software breaks, the wallet breaks, the person who holds the money in that wallet loses everything. And who do they call? There's no bank to call. There's no third party to call. They live with the consequences of that hack. They live with the consequences of that failure. And how can I go with a straight face and tell the elderly and tell the last generation, this system is so much better than the system they grew up under. When things break, no one's there to save them, and no one's there to help them. And I didn't even do the proper work of building the software. That's a big problem in our industry. But we're getting there, and we're actually now seeing more people use formal methods. And that's truly amazing if you think about it, that a movement started not too long ago in the scope of things, and already it's become global. Already it's attracted some of the best and brightest. It's already got the university systems involved. In fact, if you go to the major academic conferences, there's hundreds of universities that are actually representing and writing papers. Thousands of engineers doing really interesting things. It's a very Darwinian system. Lots of stuff dies out. Lots of stuff grows up. And there's just an amazing solution space of various different problems. And amazingly, we keep seeing more people join. So, we've been in crypto winter now for about a year. Might be a few more years. I've been through 5 or 6 of them now. The hardest one was when Bitcoin went from $30 to $1. That was pretty tough. And we'll probably be through it again. Yet coming out on the other side, I think our fundamentals are pretty solid. And I think our space is pretty solid. And I'm glad to see everybody here, and I'm glad to see that things are still moving along. And I'm glad to see that real solutions are coming out. And I'm glad to see that the conversation is continuing. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I do appreciate it. And I think we have enough time for at least 1 or 2 questions. So thank you for coming. Anyone have a question? Okay. Hang on a second. We're going to do this talk show style.
It's an honor to see you. Charles, I've heard good work from Chris Cleverly about what you're doing in Africa. What is your motivation for working in Africa, and what are your plans, and what do you hope it will happen, let's say, within 10 years if they all work out?
That's a good question. So what are we doing in Africa? Well, you have 2 types of blockchains that you can deploy, the permissioned and the permissionless. So the permissionless is what we think about when we think about Ethereum and Bitcoin and these types of systems, and basically they're just that. Anybody can join, anybody can try to run them. It's really no invitation, just we tell you what the party is and you can come if you want to. Permissioned, on the other hand, has some sort of notion of control. Somebody's in charge. Could be one entity, could be a federation of entities, could be 10,000 people, but somebody's in charge. And there's a preset logic behind how this works. Africa in particular is one of the most exciting continents in the world to be an entrepreneur in. They're the youngest continent. Go to Ethiopia, over 70% of the population is under the age of 30. Most of them are internet aware, internet savvy. Education is exponentially improving, and there's an enormous amount of entrepreneurship. So this young, increasingly better educated class is pushing social change at the top and forcing governments that have historically been very corrupt and bureaucratic and very inefficient to update their entire operating system. How people vote, how people register property, how people register land or their business, how supply chains are done. So what we're trying to do is be part of that conversation in Africa about how do we update these government services. In particular, let's look at Ethiopia. They have 1.5 million coffee farmers in Ethiopia. Most of them live on less than a hectare of land, and when they go to sell their coffee, they put satchels on the back of a donkey, and they ride it to the nearest washing station. Okay, so how's price discovery work there? Text messages, send them out and say who's buying and what are you charging and so forth. So how do you trace and track beans through such a chain? It's hard. And if you have goals like carbon reduction or fair trade or biodiversity, improving farming practices that are more sustainable, you actually need to model that entire chain out. So you need to go from a low-tech, paper-based, human-based system to a much higher-tech digital system. So why not put a blockchain inside that? Because then you also get immutability and time stamping and auditability with these types of systems. So what we do and how we enter these jurisdictions is we go and we train up a local cohort of people. So in case of Ethiopia, we've been training 23 developers there, all female, 4 from Uganda, 19 from Ethiopia. And once they matriculate, then we roll them over in new pilots. So we'll do a supply chain pilot, for example, with the coffee industry there. Should that pilot be successful, what we'll do is we'll start a public-private partnership. Government owns part of it, we own part of it, the local employees own part of it, and we go ahead and roll out the solution to all 1.5 million coffee farmers. And suddenly they have wallets, suddenly they have digital identity, suddenly they have a digital structure to interface with, which is interoperable with permissionless systems like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Cardano and so forth. So we're improving something for the government, we're creating a sustainable model, it's being built by local people there once trained. And in the same token, we're bringing 1.5 million new people into the cryptocurrency space. That's an example of a solution that we do, and because it's franchisable, we can take that from Ethiopia to Angola to Uganda and other such places. Next question. Miyataki or you guys pick.
Okay, I have a question regarding when you look at the current situation. All the blockchain, it's not widely accepted yet in the industry or in the retail world. What is the real driver, to make that happen, mass adoption, and when do you think it's going to happen?
Right. This is why I like the concept of adoption through government services, because especially in places where you don't have incumbents to protect. Because you have, for example, the state of Wyoming, it's the United States. They're still doing paper-based business registration. Recently, IHK left Hong Kong and they moved into Wyoming. In the process of doing that, I still had to sign papers by hand. And that's just strange. Like the richest, most powerful country in the world still has one of its states on paper this late in the game. So when you upgrade these types of systems and you go to digital systems, you always invite the conversation of, well, should we make this a blockchain system as well? And the moment you go down that road, then all of a sudden you're talking about allocating cryptographic credentials to people. And then that in itself has a whole laundry list of great consumer-friendly consequences. There was a technology back in 1991, for example, had it taken off, we live right now in a password-free internet. That sounds pretty good, right? You never have to remember a password ever again. And every time you want to log into a website, you just click a button and it logs in, and it's more secure than having a password. This technology was called PGP. One of the principal reasons it didn't take off was it was too hard to maintain those cryptographic assets in that whole ecosystem. But had it, it would have been a very different world. So similarly, what you do is you say, if we can get government services to adopt this technology, and then we can use them to help manage those assets with their citizens, then we can leverage the fact that we now have a gateway to them to actually wire them into all the cryptocurrency infrastructure we have. And then it's just a matter of entrepreneurs dreaming up experiences which are compelling to the consumer. It's really hard in 1994 to say, well, how will the internet take over everything? We kind of fundamentally know that the internet is going to be awesome because we can move information instantly, but YouTube and Facebook and Google and Amazon, these concepts hadn't quite yet percolated yet through. So what was needed was good infrastructure. We needed the web browser, and we needed ISPs to get to a certain level of maturity. And similarly, the infrastructure of onboarding people has to be made simple. Some of that's hardware, some of that's good software, some of that is compulsory where they need to create these assets to be able to interface with the systems. But once that's in place, then you can hook into that, just like I say, hey, they have a web browser, I can create a website, they can hook into that, and then it's a competition for hearts and minds. Now the advantage there is the financial incentive to do it. It's just like Silicon Valley. People are going to go and create these great experiences and so forth. But it'll come. It's like surveying people in 2005, did you create a cell phone app for your business? Almost 99.9% of people would have said no. 2015, everybody's saying yes, or we have a plan to create one for our business because it's necessary, right? So these things will come, but you have to make sure you have the foundational stuff done first. All right, I wish I could answer some more, but I have to get going, everybody. Cheers.